In the early morning hours of October 29, 2018, the world watched in shock and disbelief as a routine flight turned into a horrifying tragedy. It was a clear day in Jakarta, Indonesia, as Lion Air Flight 610 finished boarding its 189 passengers and crew onto its new Boeing 737 MAX 8. This flight was supposed to be a short and uneventful journey, but quickly turned into a nightmare. As the aircraft took off and climbed into the skies, things started going terribly wrong. In the cockpit, voices grew tense as the pilots tried to make sense of the situation. Passengers, meanwhile, were unaware of the unfolding drama as the aircraft descended towards the Java Sea. Air traffic controllers noticed the erratic flight path and tried to communicate with the crew. Desperate attempts were made to guide the plane safely back to the airport. But it was too late. In a tragic and devastating moment, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea, just 13 minutes after takeoff. Rescuers and authorities rushed to the scene, but the hopes of finding survivors quickly faded. All 189 souls on board had been lost. Several months later, the same tragic malfunction happened to Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, resulting in the death of 157 people, bringing the total loss of life for the Boeing 737 MAX to 346. Shortly after the second crash, all 737 MAX flights were permanently grounded, and investigations were launched to discover the source of the malfunctions and bring to heel those responsible. But who was responsible? Is it Boeing, who manufactures the 737 MAX? Or is it the regulatory bodies that approve aircraft for commercial use? What about the airlines themselves who purchase the planes and implement safety standards? Or could the pilots be at fault, who are the last line of defense when it comes to safety? Ultimately, no matter who is to blame, there has undoubtedly been a fiery trail of unethical decision-making, culminating in these two tragic and avoidable incidents. The following is a short video produced by Vox that goes into great detail about the backstory and technical details of the problem with the 737 MAX.
The two biggest airplane manufacturers in the world are Airbus and Boeing, and they have a fierce rivalry. If one of them can offer a better plane, the other could lose a lot of money. That's exactly what was about to happen in 2010. Airbus announced that they would update their most popular model, the A320, a single-aisle airplane that services many domestic flights. You've probably been on one. For this new plane, Airbus had a big update. It would have a new kind of engine. It was much larger than the previous engine, but it would make the plane 15% more fuel efficient. And just as importantly, this upgrade wouldn't change the plane that much. A pilot could walk into the new model with little additional training and be on their way. It was called the A320neo, and it would save airlines a lot of money. This was a problem for Boeing. To compete with Airbus, Boeing's obvious move was to upgrade the engine on their single-aisle plane, the 737. But there was one issue. Here's a sketch of the 737 next to the Airbus A320. Notice how the 737 is lower to the ground than the A320. This meant Airbus could slide a new engine under the wing of their A320, but there wasn't enough room under the wing of the Boeing 737. But a few months later, Boeing's product development head had big news. He said, "We figured out a way to get a big enough engine under the wing." Their solution was to move up the engine on the wing so that it would be slightly higher, and it would fit on their 737s. Here's a promotional video of that updated 737 in the air. You can actually see that the top of the engine is above the wing. Boeing called this model the 737 MAX. And just like Airbus with the A320, Boeing said that their new plane was so similar to its predecessor that pilots would only need minimal additional training. The 737 MAX became the hottest selling plane on the market, and it helped Boeing keep up with Airbus. Except moving the engine up on the 737 had a side effect. When the 737 MAX was in full thrust, like during takeoff, the nose tended to point too far upward, which could lead to a stall. This was a problem because these planes were supposed to behave exactly like the old ones. So Boeing came up with a workaround. Instead of re-engineering the planes, they installed software that automatically pushed the nose downward if the pilot flew the plane at too high of an angle. They called it the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. But because Boeing was selling the 737 MAX as pretty much the same plane as the 737, they didn't highlight the new MCAS system. Many pilots only got a 2-hour iPad course before entering the cockpit for the first time. And the training material didn't mention the MCAS software. In 2018, several American pilots complained to the federal government that the 737 MAX was suddenly nosing down. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta. In the flight report, which shows the plane's altitude over time, you can see that the plane was in full thrust during takeoff. But at a certain point, the nose of the plane kept lurching downward. The pilots couldn't figure out why this was happening. The captain asked the first officer to check the quick reference handbook. They couldn't find the solution. The pilots continued to fight with the MCAS. The plane struggled to gain altitude. Reports show it was likely because the computer was getting incorrect sensor data, pushing the plane toward the earth below. 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into the Java Sea. In the Ethiopia crash, the report shows that the pilots were actually able to disable the MCAS, but it was too late to overcome the malfunctioning MCAS sensors. For now, nearly every 737 MAX 8 in service has been grounded, and the Federal Aviation Administration is facing scrutiny over how they rushed this plane through certification. Boeing's response has been to apply a software update that makes the MCAS less aggressive, while also saying they'll increase pilot training on how to turn it off. This problem started with the company's race to compete with its rival. It pushed them to pretend like their new plane behaved exactly like their old one, even when it didn't.
The Boeing 737 MAX tragedy offers a stark illustration of the complex interplay between ethical decision-making, industry competition, safety considerations, and economic pressures. At its core, the disaster resulted from a series of errors and questionable managerial choices, a narrative all too familiar in such tragic events. However, deeper examination reveals that these missteps sprang from a genuine desire to deliver an aircraft that was not only superior, but also safer for its customers. The ethical dilemma arises when we consider the decisions driven by external pressures and internal pressures from stakeholders and management. These pressures led to the unfortunate compromise of safety standards in favor of speed and cost reduction. The ethical question remains: who benefited from Boeing's irresponsible actions? Facing significant competition from Airbus, Boeing's strategy was to reuse many systems from their previous generation 737, aiming to reduce training costs for new pilots and saving airlines millions. In theory, this approach promised benefits for a wide range of stakeholders, from Boeing to airlines to the pilots themselves, and also the millions of customers who fly commercially. This arrangement was also seemingly advantageous for the FAA. By trusting Boeing to oversee itself, the FAA could allocate fewer resources for oversight and certification, allowing them to put that time and money into any other number of pressing needs. However, the benefits that appeared promising in theory ultimately have been completely nullified because of the loss of 364 innocent lives. Boeing now faces the challenge of repairing its tarnished reputation, not to mention the billions lost in revenue and market capitalization. The FAA, once a beacon of proper government oversight, needs to prove it can reestablish itself as a diligent regulator, rather than one that has been too close to the industry it was meant to guide. While difficult to mention in the light of human suffering, the economic fallout of the 737 MAX cannot be understated. Direct costs associated with the grounding of the 737 are estimated at around $20 billion. At the time of grounding, Boeing had 4,636 unfilled orders of the 737 MAX, worth an estimated $600 billion. All production and delivery of the aircraft was immediately put on hold. Each month of the production stop cost Boeing around $1.8 to $2.5 billion in delayed revenue. Between 2018 and 2020, more than 1,000 orders were canceled for the 737 MAX, while orders for the Airbus A320neo nearly doubled from that of Boeing's. As a result of the 737 groundings in March of 2019, Boeing incurred $18 billion in losses by the end of 2019. In the days following the Ethiopian airline crash, Boeing's stock fell nearly 18%, a drop in market capitalization of nearly $40 billion. On top of the catastrophic financial impact that affected Boeing directly, Boeing has a supply chain of over 8,000 independent suppliers that help support the building of the 737 MAX. The stoppage in production devastated the supply chain, and many workers and their families were adversely impacted. On January 7, 2021, Boeing settled to pay $1.77 billion in damages to various airliners and their customers. In March of 2020, Boeing sought out a government bailout of nearly $60 billion under the too big to fail theory. The U.S. Senate voted to grant $17 billion in aid to Boeing through the Coronavirus Aid and Economic Security Act, known as CARES. When considering the actions of Boeing, beginning from their original design and conceptualization, and extending to their response to the notable incidents involving it, it is difficult to find any moral or ethical lens which sees their actions favorably. Under pressure from other competitive players in the airplane production industry, most notably Airbus, Boeing chose to place short-term gain and profit above safety, which should always be the paramount concern in aviation. Instead, they tried to apply band-aid fixes through flight software that could sidestep the issue. This reveals not only an issue with the production of the 737 MAX itself, but underlying issues with Boeing's ethical decision-making that seem to prioritize the short-term benefits over long-term stability. While the rights and lives of people outside of the United States should be considered equal to those within its borders, it can be assumed by Boeing's actions that they do not take this point of view. This is most evident with the parties most affected by this issue, those of the international carriers and countries who experience the crashes. They simply do not have the same resources or pull as those of the U.S., and it is understandable that they would default to trusting the FAA and Boeing as a company to ensure that safety was considered in the development, testing, and certification of their aircraft. With Boeing's actions, those stakeholders who have the least power and pull in the industry suffered the greatest consequences. In conclusion, Boeing failed to take into consideration its responsibility to the public, its customers, its extended stakeholders, and its own significant pull in the aviation industry. There is a saying in the industry which relates to safety, which essentially notes that all regulations and laws in aviation are written in blood. The prominence of aviation accidents and incidents throughout history have created a regulatory environment and safety culture which surpasses most other industries in existence. However, Boeing made a conscious and concerted decision to shirk all of its responsibilities in the development, marketing, and operation of the 737 MAX airliner. It is difficult to imagine the great number of managers, executives, engineers, and government regulators who turned a blind eye to the decisions leading up to those eventful and fatal accidents. But the financial, regulatory, and human costs will continue to be felt for decades to come.